Hello and welcome to the Rogers Brief. I'm Adam Rogers. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening. Today was day 57 of the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings, and it's the last day before the Commission takes a 3-week break into August. We'll come back later in August to hear from the head RCMP officer in Nova Scotia at the time of the mass casualty events, Lee Bergerman, and RCMP National Commissioner Brenda Lucki. But today was Chief Superintendent Chris Leather's second day on the stand. He testified yesterday as well, which I watched in person up at the Marriott in Halifax. Today, Chief Superintendent Leather was being cross-examined by the lawyers for the participants, from the family participants. It was a really interesting day. A few legal angles that I should probably explain. There were some things that went on. The witness had to be excluded from the room at one point, and then a couple other things I think I'll try to explain anyway to make sure people understood what was happening at that point. And then later on, Chief Superintendent Leather was a very, again, I thought, subdued witness. I'd be really curious, anybody who was watching him, he spoke even on his longer answers in a very sort of monotone way. I wonder if he was like that before, or if this is a new demeanor in reaction to his role in the events or whatever. So that was sort of an observation of him personally. But before I get to that, just a few things. So one thing I noticed when Commissioner Fitch was introducing the day, so today was dedicated to the cross-examination of Chris Leather, Chief Superintendent Leather, but the words cross-examination did not feature in Commissioner Fitch's introduction. She said, instead of saying that the participants' counsel will cross-examine, that she said that Rachel Young, Commission counsel, will facilitate questions from participants' counsel, which is really a different way of putting it. Probably there was it was cross-examination by participants' counsel. Don't know why she wouldn't use that phrase, other than sort of another way to subtly marginalize the participants and their lawyers. So I thought that was an interesting just a choice of words on the part of Commissioner Fitch. But into the substance of it, it started off where I expected with, so Michael Scott was asking the first set of questions, Michael Scott from Patterson Law, representing many of the affected families. And he started where Chief Superintendent Leather, where I expected he would. Chief Superintendent Leather yesterday, in answer to a question about Brenda Lucki's phone call to the group, a conference call where Brenda Lucki was critical of the Nova Scotia RCMP not releasing the makes and models of the firearms because she had, we can put together that she had given a promise or had told the public safety minister, the prime minister's office, that she would ensure that those details were released. So yesterday, Chief Superintendent Leather declined to answer a question related to that call and said he wanted to have legal counsel, legal advice before he did so. And Ms. Young, lawyer for the Mass Casualty Commission, just moved on to the next set of questions. Well, today Michael Scott started right there. So the issue was that Chief Superintendent Leather had actually given an interview, a recorded interview with through an internal RCMP process. It was a wellness interview. So the RCMP hired a firm in Ottawa to interview the senior RCMP officers who were involved in the Portapic situation and the response as a wellness interview, just to see how they're doing. And during that interview, Chief Superintendent Leather says he spoke about this phone call from Commissioner Lucki and how he felt about it. But the issue was that hadn't been disclosed. Even the fact of the interview hadn't been disclosed to the Mass Casualty Commission. And so in preparation for the interview that he did before testifying, in preparation for that interview with the Mass Casualty Commission lawyers, Chris Leather's asking the DOJ lawyers, should I tell them about this wellness interview that I did where I already spoke about this call with Commissioner Luckey. And the advice from the DOJ lawyers, Laurie Ward and Patricia McPhee, according to Chris Leather, was to not reveal it, not to proactively mention that the interview had taken place or any of the contents of it, although if you're asked about it, then answer the questions honestly. Well, they would have or should have known that he wouldn't be asked about it because the Mass Casualty Commission had no notice that this process had taken place, and so would have no reason to ask any questions about it because they didn't know about it in the first place. So effectively what it was the DOJ lawyers telling a senior RCMP officer not to reveal that there was additional disclosure that could be available, that could be sought out by the Mass Casualty Commission. Not unlike I had seen in their previous, behavior during the Desmond inquiry, where there was some issues of disclosure from the DOJ. I guess it seems indicative of the Department of Justice's approach or philosophy when it comes to these kind of inquiries. So it was an interesting little moment. So people that were watching would have seen that Chief Superintendent Leather started to talk about this and the advice. He said, I waive privilege. So that's for an individual can waive privilege. The lawyer who gave them the advice, that's solicitor-client privilege. So when you receive advice from a lawyer, you don't have to tell anybody what that advice was. But you're allowed to. You can waive privilege and reveal that advice. And so Chris Leather was about to do this, and he started to talk about it a little bit. Laurie Ward from the DOJ stood up and objected and started giving her version of events. And so the commission was starting to hear from Laurie Ward, and Josh Bryson very rightly stood up and objected to Ms. Ward's interjection and said, well, the witness shouldn't be in the room while we're hearing this because she was trying to give an alternate explanation. Well, that's, maybe not what we meant or didn't mean it that way or whatever. And Josh Bryson correctly noted that the witness shouldn't be in the room hearing that. So Chris Leather was sent out for a second while the discussion continued and then brought back in, and he answered the questions and described everything that I've just conveyed. So that was an interesting moment, and I think speaks to the DOJ approach to all of this. Some other things that Chris Leather talked about. He's not happy with the investigation into the access to firearms. Doesn't sound like the RCMP received any cooperation from the FBI or the United States police forces to charge people, the Sean Conlaw individual, others potentially in the United States who were involved. So Chris Leather's not happy about that, but that seems to be closed and not going to be pursued any further. The relationship with the Truro Police and the RCMP, and specifically the request from Chief McNeil of the Truro Police to Chris Leather to say, listen, if you need any help, this was the morning of the 19th. If you need any help, let me know. And what Chris Leather said today is that Chief McNeil should have known to contact somebody at the district level, somebody more local, if he was going to offer help of that nature. Another point, Chief Superintendent Leather referred the Joey Weber death to CIRT, the Serious Incident Response Team. Whenever there's a police shooting or a suspected potential police shooting, that's the protocol. There was no CIRT report into that. I think it became quickly apparent, I presume anyway, that Mr. Weber died at the hands of Gabriel Wortman. And so that, what Chris Leather said, though, was that early on, they weren't sure if there might have been, accidentally or whatever, involvement of Heidi Stevenson's firearm, so that they thought it should be investigated. But that would have been a very quick investigation from what I can gather. An interesting little note, So Michael Scott was asking Chief Superintendent Leather about the Big Stop videos and the perceived danger of having those leaked or released to the public. And in the course of giving that answer, Chief Superintendent Leather referred to the Brinks video, which was released. So the video from the Brinks location in Burnside where Wortman goes in, gets $475,000 in cash, and leaves. And it's all on video. Well, of course, many suspected that was evidence that there was a connection between Wortman and the police, perhaps as an agent or as an informant, and this was his payment for those services. There's been evidence since then from the CIBC that this was money that Wortman had in his accounts, a GIC and a line of credit, and that money was just done, and this was the process chosen. But in describing that video today, Chief Superintendent Chris Leather described it as cash payment. He used the words cash payment. So probably just a casual choice of words on his part, but maybe it was a slip. I don't know. When asked about the press conferences, so this was his main role, it seemed, in the aftermath of the events. He was asked about his comments of saying in excess of 10 people were killed when he knew at the time the number was 17 and probably higher. He regrets that he said they were all adults when he knew Emily Tuck, a 17-year-old Emily Tuck, was among the victims. He said he regrets that to this day. He said that was a recall issue, that he'd been briefed on it earlier in the day, and just when he was asked the question, didn't recall it properly, and so he regrets that. He was self-critical at times, and that was one of them. I noticed that about him today. He also said in his press conference that Wortman was not known to police, and he answered that as to say, well, he didn't have a criminal record and he wasn't known in that sense, and there's not perhaps a technical definition of known to police. Seems that the police give that a broad definition when it suits their interest and a narrow one when it doesn't. I'm not sure, and it seems like in this case, the narrower definition of known to police suited the RCMP's goals of trying to portray that they could have never seen this coming or had no way of knowing that this person was a danger. So all of that there was a long talk about the press conference contents and how he was prepared for that by the Office of Strategic Communications. Michael Scott picked up on a point I made yesterday, which was really, in a way, the existence of the Office of Strategic Communications is part of the problem, that they are training these officers basically how to conceal information and not just saying, all right, just go in there with what you know and answer the questions. So I think that was a point, and to an extent at least, Chief Superintendent Leather agreed with that. Another part, I think, in thinking of the public relations side of this and the RCMP's reputation in the communities affected, Chief Superintendent Leather gave a long description of his meeting with the fire department at Onslow Belmont, tour of the building, and efforts, self-perceived efforts at least, to mend those fences, go right by the fire department, look after the damage to the building, that sort of thing, and just try to repair that relationship. So he spent a long time talking about that. You could tell it seemed important to him that be done, and that he felt it incumbent on him to take on the responsibility of repairing that relationship. He also mentioned about John Robin, RCMP officer who falsely portrayed himself as being employed by the Mass Casualty Commission on his business card, who went to interview members of the community in Onslow Belmont, including Sharon McClellan. Very misleading to have the Mass Casualty Commission listed on his business card, which, of course, that was published by Frank Magazine quite some time ago, and other people knew it, but it just came out today in questioning again with Chief Superintendent Leather. So that was a difficulty. So what was probably most striking, and I'll close off on jumping ahead a little bit, I'll come back to this. Jumping ahead, Josh Bryson had some questions about the focus on Heidi Stevenson to the exclusion of the other victims in the press conference and in the supplement, I guess you might say, of a liaison, family liaison officer. There was one family liaison officer for 22 families and 2 liaison officers for Constable Stevenson's family. And Chief Superintendent Leather accepted that criticism or that perspective, and I guess committed to doing better if in future instances, and thinks that should be adopted across the country, that the RCMP should be more sensitive to how those kinds of things can be perceived among other victims. So the last thing I want to mention, though, is a question. People may have been a little startled by this, because Chief Superintendent Leather was asked by Michael Scott at the end of his questioning, and then by Thomas McDonald, who followed up, well, if this happened today, there's new standards now on the emergency alert, and they talked about that a little bit. There's new standards that have been developed as to when the emergency alert would be issued, and Chris Leather was involved in those discussions, provincially and nationally. Well, so if this same scenario happened now, if a Portapic situation happened now, would the emergency alert be issued? And most people would expect the answer to be yes, of course it would be issued. Chris Leather didn't say that. He vacillated on the answer and said, it would depend on the circumstances and be issue for the critical incident commander to decide whether an emergency alert would be issued. Seems bizarre given everything we know, and that would be the answer. What I think Chris Leather had in mind when giving that answer is the civil case that is ongoing, separate and apart from the Mass Casualty Commission. In that case, what the families are the families are suing the RCMP for their performance, the reaction to the events. And if the RCMP, a senior RCMP officer like Chris Leather, was to admit, yes, we absolutely would issue an emergency alert now, well, then that would reflect back and be used against them in the civil case to show that, well, you didn't in this case, and therefore you are clearly liable for everything that happened up after the point where the emergency alert should have been issued. I mean, that's going to be their case anyway, and I think it's a strong point that the RCMP is not going to be able to refute, but they wouldn't want to just hand over that issue by Chris Leather today saying, yes, definitely would have been issued if the same circumstances were to unfold today. So that was, I suspect, the reason he gave that answer. It's not a satisfactory answer. I don't think it'll be accepted by anybody, and hopefully it's only given for that civil case purpose, and that in fact, if there was an active shooter who was mobile and uncontained, that the police would in fact issue an emergency alert. But their failure to admit to that and to accept that would be the case and say yes, of course, really doesn't bode well in a way for their future prospects or their future continuation of running policing throughout much of Nova Scotia. So that was those are some of the highlights from today. Really interesting day. A lot of admissions of fault, of falling short by Chief Superintendent Leather, up to a point anyway, and he was self-critical as well. So that's it for now, and the Mass Casualty Commission has taken a 3-week break, and I may do so as well. I'll use the time to start working on my alternate report and maybe take a few days off here and there as well to enjoy the summer. Hope you guys all do the same. If anything major happens in the meantime, Mass Casualty Commission related, I'll certainly be back to talk about that. The end of August will be busy. We'll be hearing from the head RCMP officer in Nova Scotia, Lee Bergman at the time, head of the RCMP nationally, Brenda Lucky. The Parliamentary National Security and Public Safety Committee is also going to be back in session around that time too. So there'll be lots of news around later in August. If anything happens in the meantime, I'll bring that to you. So in the meantime, thanks again for watching. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.